He grabbed her by the arm, not firmly, not the way you'd stop someone from walking into traffic, but the way you grab something that belongs to you. Like luggage, like a door you're about to slam shut. You're in the wrong section, ma'am. The diner was full that Tuesday morning. Booths along the windows, counter stools lined with regulars, the smell of bacon grease and fresh coffee going back 30 years. Maybelle's. Everyone in Crestfield, Georgia knew Maybelle's. The peeling sign outside, the cracked vinyl on the corner booth, the way Doris behind the counter remembered your order before you sat down. Some places become part of a town's memory without anyone deciding they should. Maybelle's was that kind of place. The woman at the center of all this, the one whose arm was now being held, didn't flinch. That was the first thing people noticed later when they talked about it. She didn't gasp. She didn't pull away. She simply looked down at the hand on her arm, the way you might look at something unpleasant you'd stepped in, then looked up at the face it belonged to. Her name was Lenora Holt. She was 61 years old. She wore a plain gray cardigan, dark slacks, and a pair of reading glasses pushed up into her hair. She'd ordered the same thing she always ordered when she came through Crestfield. Black coffee, wheat toast, 2 eggs over easy. She'd been sitting at the counter for 11 minutes before the hand appeared. The hand belonged to Tanner Wexford, 26 years old, 6 feet and change, built like someone who'd played high school ball and never quite left it behind. He wore a sheriff's department uniform, not because he was a deputy, but because his father was Sheriff Dale Wexford, and because in a town like Crestfield, the line between who you are and who your father is tends to blur past the point of recognition. I said, Tanner repeated, louder now, slower. The way people speak when they've decided the other person is either stupid or deaf. You're in the wrong section. Doris, behind the counter, set down the coffee pot. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. There was no wrong section at Maybelle's. There hadn't been since 1964, technically, but the way Tanner used the phrase, the weight he put behind it, the particular curl at the corner of his mouth, made the meaning clear enough. Lenora Holt looked at him for a long moment. I don't believe I am, she said. Quiet, measured. The way someone speaks when they've been trained to keep their voice below the level of the thing trying to provoke it. Tanner Wexford smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. You know who my father is? She didn't answer. Because I could make a call right now, he said, releasing her arm and pulling out his phone, holding it up like a prop. And this whole morning gets a lot more complicated for you. The diner had gone quiet. Not suddenly, gradually, the way sound drains from a room when people realize something is happening and instinctively decide they'd rather not be part of it. 14 people in Maybelle's that morning. Not one of them said a word. This is the part that haunts it, if you think about it long enough. Not Tanner Wexford. People like Tanner Wexford exist in every town, in every iteration, in every generation. What haunted it was the 14. The way they found something very interesting in their coffee cups. The way they suddenly needed to check their phones. The specific geometry of looking away. One man, booth by the door, maybe 45, flannel shirt, met Lenora's eyes for a brief second, then looked away. She watched him do it. She turned back to her coffee. I'd like to finish my breakfast, she said. What happened next happened fast. Tanner Wexford had not expected that answer. In his experience, limited in the ways that matter, abundant in the ways that don't, people either argued back and gave him a reason to escalate, or they apologized and retreated. He didn't have a script for quiet refusal. It unsettled him, and unsettled men with something to prove tend to reach for the loudest available option. He reached for her arm again. This time he didn't hold it, he pulled. The stool scraped against the tile floor. Lenora Holt's coffee cup tipped, caught by Doris's reflexes before it fully fell. Tanner moved toward the door, not running but not walking either. The particular gait of someone who has decided the exit is the victory. Walk it off, he said, pushing the door open with his shoulder, keeping hold of her arm. Outside, the morning light was flat and white. Early October in Georgia. Past summer's heat but not yet cold. The trees just beginning to consider changing. Lenora Holt stood in the parking lot of Maybelle's diner and did not raise her voice. That is what people who were watching through the window would remember. Not that she fought, not that she cried. that she stood there in that gray cardigan in the middle of the parking lot and was completely, utterly still. Tanner made his call. His father's deputy arrived 7 minutes later. A young man named Kyle, who looked like he'd rather be somewhere else, but didn't know how to arrange that. He stood beside Tanner, asked a few questions, wrote something down in a notepad. She came in making trouble, Tanner said. Kyle looked at Lenora. She looked back at him. Ma'am, Kyle said, with the particular exhaustion of someone who understands exactly what is happening and has decided he cannot afford to say so, I'm going to need to ask you to wait here a moment. Of course, she said. Her car was parked 3 spaces from the entrance. A rental. She'd flown into Atlanta the night before and driven down. Nothing remarkable about the vehicle. Nothing remarkable about the woman, if you were the kind of person who used remarkable to mean loud or young or carrying the right last name. Kyle ran her license. What came back on his screen, he would later tell his wife, was the kind of thing that takes a moment to fully process. He read it twice. He looked up at the woman standing in the parking lot. Gray cardigan, reading glasses in her hair, 2 eggs cooling on a plate inside, and he read it again. He closed his laptop. He looked at Tanner. What'd it say? Tanner asked. Nothing, Kyle said. His voice had changed, just slightly. She's clear. Well, tell her she needs to. She's clear, Kyle said again. Not louder, just different. The call came 11 minutes later. Not to Kyle, not to the sheriff's department, to the federal field office in Atlanta, which relayed it to a different field office, which relayed it to a person whose job title would require a paragraph to explain, and whose actual function required fewer words. She was the kind of person other people called when something had gone wrong in a way that couldn't be uncalled. 2 vehicles, black, unmarked, federal plates. They pulled into the Maybell's parking lot with no sirens and no theater. Just the quiet, deliberate arrival of something that had been moving toward this moment for 11 minutes and didn't need to announce itself. The door of the first vehicle opened. The man who stepped out was 64 years old. He wore the dress uniform of a United States Deputy Secretary of something, not military, though he had been that too, for 22 years before the other thing. His shoes were the kind that get polished every morning, not from vanity, but from habit. He walked like a person for whom the ground has always been exactly where he expected it to be. His name was not important yet. What was important was the moment he crossed the parking lot and came to stand in front of Lenora Holt, and the moment after that, when he reached out, not to shake her hand, not to hug her, but to straighten the lapel of her cardigan. The small, familiar gesture of someone who has known another person long enough to perform the ordinary kindnesses automatically. Lenora, he said. Quiet. James, she said. He turned to look at Tanner Wexford. The thing about Tanner Wexford was that he had spent his entire life in a town where his father's name was the largest object in any room. You stopped someone at Maybell's and you had the sheriff behind you. You had the uniform. You had the badge. You had the 30 years of favors owed and debts forgiven. You had the phone. You had the certainty. He had never stood in a parking lot and watched that certainty become something else. You want to tell me, James said, not asking, not threatening, simply organizing information. What exactly you were doing with your hand on this woman's arm? Tanner opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. She was. I'm going to stop you there, James said, because I'm going to need you to think very carefully about whatever you're about to say. Think about it the way you'd think about something you can't take back. Because you can't. Inside Maybell's, the 14 people who had found their coffee cups so interesting were now finding the parking lot more interesting. Doris had stepped to the window. The man in the flannel shirt by the door had not moved. He was watching. He didn't look away this time. One of the black vehicles had a federal seal on the door. One of the people who'd stepped out of the second vehicle was making a phone call. Kyle, who had been standing slightly to Tanner's left, had taken 3 small steps to the right. Subtle, almost unconscious, the body's way of choosing a side before the mind admits it's doing so. Lenora Holt watched all of this. She had been a federal district court judge for 19 years. Before that, she'd spent 11 years as a federal prosecutor. Before that, 3 years clerking for a Supreme Court justice whose name appeared in the kind of history books that sit on law school shelves and get opened when something important needs context. She had sat in courtrooms and rendered decisions that shaped the contours of cases that shaped the contours of law. She had done this quietly, the way serious work tends to get done, without announcing itself, without requiring an audience, without needing anyone in a parking lot in Crestfield, Georgia, to know about it. She had never needed anyone to know. She had needed a cup of coffee and 2 eggs over easy on a Tuesday morning in October, and instead she had gotten a hand on her arm and a parking lot and a man asking if she knew who his father was. She knew who his father was. She also knew who she was, which had always been the more relevant fact, even when no one else in the room had access to it. James turned back to Tanner. My name is James Aldridge. I am the former Deputy Attorney General of the United States, and Lenora Holt is a sitting federal district court judge. You put your hands on a federal judge. A pause. Twice. The word twice landed in the parking lot and sat there. Kyle made a sound. Not a word, just the sound a person makes when understanding arrives a few seconds too late. I thought, Tanner started. I know what you thought, James said. That's actually the problem. What happened after that? Happened in the way these things happen, when the machinery of consequence finally catches up to the casual certainty of someone who has never experienced consequence before. It was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no handcuffs produced with flair, no moment of cinematic reversal. There was instead the grinding, inevitable quality of paperwork and phone calls, and a very quiet conversation between James Aldridge and someone at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, who apparently had been waiting for a reason to look more carefully at the Wexford family's management of Crestfield's sheriff department. Turns out reasons had been accumulating for a while. Tanner Wexford sat in the back of one of those unmarked vehicles for 40 minutes, not arrested, not yet, but sitting, which was its own kind of information. His phone had been quietly, politely taken from him at the 7-minute mark. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the seat in front of him, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself. Kyle sat in his cruiser and called his wife. She didn't answer. He left a voicemail that said, basically, I should have said something. He'd say it again later, in person, and she would nod and say yes, and he would spend a while understanding what that meant. Inside Maybelle's, Doris reheated Lenora's coffee without being asked. She brought new toast. The first round had gone cold. She set it down on the counter and looked at Lenora Holt and said, I'm sorry about that, and meant it in the specific way of someone who is apologizing not just for what happened, but for the 11 seconds she'd spent deciding whether to speak up and choosing instead to pick up the coffee pot. Lenora accepted the apology without comment. She ate her toast. She drank her coffee. James came in when it was mostly done, when the vehicles were finishing their business, when Tanner had been transported not to jail, but to a conversation he was going to wish had been jail by the end of it, when the paperwork had started its long journey through the system. He sat on the stool next to Lenora and ordered coffee from Doris and didn't say anything for a while. You knew I was coming through today, Lenora said. Called ahead, he said. She looked at him. I was already in Atlanta, he said. Had a meeting. Figured I'd come down. A pause. Good thing. I had it handled, she said. No, you did. She drank her coffee. He asked me if I knew who his father was, she said. Not bitter, just factual. The way you'd note the weather. James nodded. People like that always do. The whole room went quiet, she said. 14 people. I know. Not one of them. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. James wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. One of them came out when you were in the parking lot, he said. Man in a flannel shirt, told Kyle he'd seen everything. Said he'd testify if it came to that. Lenora was quiet for a moment. Better late than nothing, she said. Yes. She looked out the window at the parking lot, now emptying, the vehicles pulling out, the extraordinary machinery of consequence retreating back into the ordinary morning. A woman with a stroller walked past on the sidewalk. A truck pulled in wanting breakfast. I've been a judge for 19 years, Lenora said. I've sent men to prison. I've overturned convictions that should never have been convictions. I've sat in a courtroom and done the work that doesn't make headlines because good work rarely does. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. And this morning, I just wanted eggs. Doris, passing behind the counter, pretended not to hear. Then she stopped, turned around. Yours are on the house, she said. Today and every Tuesday you come through. Lenora looked up at her. There are moments where the right gesture, at the right time, from an unexpected direction, lands differently than intended. Doris hadn't planned a speech. She hadn't rehearsed anything. She had a counter to wipe and more tables to seat, and the breakfast rush wasn't finished. But she stopped and said what she said, because some things accumulate to a point where staying quiet feels like its own kind of choice. Lenora Holt nodded once. Thank you, Doris. James paid for his coffee, left a tip that Doris would talk about later, and walked out to finish what he'd come to finish. The GBI would spend the next 3 weeks conducting what they called a comprehensive review of the Crestfield Sheriff's Department, which is the language institutions use when they've found enough to keep looking. Sheriff Dale Wexford retired before the review concluded, voluntarily, he told his friends, though the timing was the kind of coincidence that explains itself. Tanner Wexford was charged on 3 counts. The trial was quiet, the way trials are when the defense has very little to say and the prosecution has a federal judge as a witness. He was convicted on 2 of the 3. He was not sent to a county facility. The federal facility was farther from Crestfield, which meant fewer visitors, which meant more time alone with the particular silence that arrives when you've spent your whole life borrowing your father's name and the loan has finally been called. His mother said, in the parking lot after sentencing, that she didn't understand how it had come to this. A bystander, not a reporter, just a person who happened to be there, said that he thought she probably did understand, actually, and that understanding and accepting were different things. He wasn't wrong. Lenora Holt drove back to Atlanta that afternoon. Flight out at 6. She had a court session Thursday morning. A civil case, complex, the kind that requires the full weight of attention. She would give it that weight. She always did. She did not issue a statement. She did not give interviews. A law clerk who had worked for her for 2 years asked when she returned to chambers if she was all right, and she said she was fine, thank you, and asked if the Thursday briefs had arrived. They had. She read them that evening, in her apartment, with a cup of tea and the quiet that serious people tend to build their lives around. What she did not say, to the clerk or anyone else, was what she had thought about in the parking lot. In those minutes between the hand on her arm and the arrival of the vehicles, what she'd thought about was not James Aldridge or her title or the license plate that ran her name through 3 databases in 11 seconds. She'd thought about the man in the flannel shirt, the way he'd met her eyes and looked away. She'd thought about every room she'd ever walked into where someone had made a calculation about what she was before knowing who she was. Every time the person at the front desk spoke a little slower, every time an elevator held a pause that wasn't there for other people, every time the question, "Do you know who I am?" wasn't asked of her, but communicated through 30 other smaller questions that all added up to the same thing, she'd thought. I have spent 61 years carrying credentials that most people never have to carry, and I am still standing in a parking lot, and that is the thing that should keep all of us up at night. Not me, specifically. The parking lot. She hadn't said any of this to James. He already knew. He'd spent 64 years in the same country. Some conversations don't need to happen out loud. She finished the briefs. She set them aside. She washed her cup and turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the doorway of her apartment, looking at nothing in particular. There was something else she thought about later that she didn't often allow herself to think about, the number of Lenora Holts who didn't have the credentials, who had stood in parking lots and in front of counters and in rooms that went quiet and had no license plate that ran 3 databases, and no James Aldridge with a federal seal on a car door, and no call that came 11 minutes after the moment everything changed. The ones for whom the 11 minutes came and went and nothing arrived. She thought about them every time. The next Tuesday, she came back through Crestfield, same route, same stop. The peeling sign, the cracked vinyl, the smell of bacon grease. Doris behind the counter, coffee pot already moving. She sat at the corner stool. She ordered black coffee, wheat toast, 2 eggs over easy. The diner was full. Somebody had put a small fresh flower in a vase on the counter. New addition. Nobody had mentioned it. Nobody needed to. Doris set the coffee down and moved on. The man in the flannel shirt was in the booth, by the door. He saw her. He nodded. Not effusively. Not with apology, just a small nod. The kind that means I see you without requiring anything more than that. She nodded back. Outside, through the window, Crestfield went about its Tuesday. A town like any other, full of people making small decisions about who they are when it counts. She drank her coffee. She ate her eggs. She left a good tip, the way she always did, because Doris had been getting up at 5 in the morning for 30 years to make sure the coffee was ready when people needed it, and that deserved acknowledgement. Some people carry things quietly their whole lives, not because they have to, because they've decided that's how the work gets done. Lenora Holt drove out of Crestfield with the windows down, the October air cool and clean, the roads stretching south toward Atlanta and Thursday, and the briefs and the work that doesn't make headlines, but holds things together nonetheless. She didn't look back. She rarely did.